has a monopoly on the truth. Our version of our own truths are based on our own lived experiences. In this space, we welcome different perspectives to learn, unlearn, and enlighten. Welcome to The Lantern. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of The Lantern Podcast. I'm sure you would have noticed that today's podcast is a little different as you're only seeing one face and hearing one voice. And I guess you guessed it, today's episode is going to be a solo cast. So I hope that you will bear with me. I will be discussing social connections. As you may be aware, May is Mental Health Awareness Month, and the theme this year is social connections. To me, social connections, it's such an important and integral topic because it informs everything that we do in our lives, whether it's friendships, family, business, or corporate. I think people are at the center of everything, yet we are apparently the loneliest that we've ever been. And I think for me, that's a great departure point because many people don't understand the nuances of being alone and being lonely. And I think that the World Health Organization has been intentional in using the word lonely to describe the pandemic as opposed to alone. Being alone is you being able to be in solitude, and in the holistic space, we obviously value having and carving out those moments of isolation and solitude for you to rest, restore, and listen to your own internal thoughts. But when we're talking about loneliness, we mean something completely different. It's almost as if it is involuntary solitude, meaning that you're not necessarily choosing to be alone, but there's an external circumstance that is forcing you into that situation. So some of the factors that are being highlighted are obviously the overuse of technology. The younger generations that are coming up and obviously are growing up around social media do not know how to make friends because they deem the virtual friendships that they make as real friends. And of course, for us, some of us who have, lived a little bit longer, we know the invaluable connection of just that physical meeting and interacting with people face to face. I think that there is social media, AI will never be able to replicate that. And as AI continues to progress and takes up more real estate, I think that the human to human parts of business, corporate, and interactions will become so much more important because we will be relying on AI for all of the, I would like to say, meaner and boring things. And that gives us such a great opportunity to really lean in and get to know people, which we may not necessarily have had the time to do because we've been consumed with these tasks that we have to do. But how great that if AI can do some of those tasks, now we do have more time to get to know each other a lot better. So I think that it's an important distinction to make between being alone and being lonely. Um, I want to start, not start, but my second point would be in talking about decolonizing mental health. And I think that it's important to include that aspect of things into every conversation because even how we've understood social connections is from a very Western perspective. And I mean, we don't need to necessarily go too far in trying to understand that there are differences. So I'll give an example. In Western psychology, your sense of belonging, your sense of identity, and social connections is usually perceived from a very individualistic perspective. So, for example, it would just be around the nuclear family. Whereas in non Western traditions and in indigenous communities, we view social connections beyond the individual and we perceive ourselves as a collective and we are part of more so a collective. So I think that these are important concepts that we sort of need to understand because when I talk about the decolonization of mental health, I think some people enjoy, when you use polarizing words and they think that it's a conversation that is aimed at dismantling one system that benefits a certain group of people. However, with everything that I'm doing, that is not my intention at all. I think we already have enough division in the world. I think we need to find spaces where there's commonalities so we can find each other again, because we're only growing further and further apart from each other. We're only getting less and less compassionate. We're only getting less invested in actually getting to know people. So I love to focus on commonalities and common thoughts and perspectives and just topics that can really bring us together. And that's another reason I love mental health, because I think it is one of those topics where you have a diverse group of people coming to the table talking about something that impacts anybody, regardless of your gender, your race, your socioeconomic circumstance, or even your geographic location. And that's why I think I love and enjoy this work so much, because it cuts through all of these perceived differences that people really are gaslighting people into leaning into, instead of taking looking at things from a higher perspective. But I say, so back to my point around belonging, it would be that, from that Western perspective, your perception of belonging and identity and social connections is quite limited and reduced, whereas non Western cultures would perceive belonging as us being part of a collective. So I would put the question to you as the listener. Is it possible for maybe non-Western people to feel lonely? I'm not sure, because they're always surrounded by some sense of community. And the other day, I actually listened to a very interesting podcast or reel or snippet from a podcast. And it was just talking about work dynamics and how, obviously we know that work and corporate culture is also informed from a is informed and influenced by Western culture. So if you present your project and your work and you say I, the manager will actually perceive that as you have done all of the work, and then you will take credit for the work. Whereas people that aren't from Western backgrounds do not necessarily feel comfortable saying I. They will say we. But I think that that can easily be misinterpreted as you didn't have a leading role in the work you were doing, or you're not capable of working by yourself. And I find that so interesting, because it's something that I hadn't necessarily considered. I've always grown up around really leaning into we and not ever saying I. And it's a recognition of I might be one person, but I represent so many people. And that, I think, is informed by the intergenerational perspective, that obviously as a child you have your parents, you have your grandparents, and then it's both sets, right? So we have this beautiful lineage that we acknowledge, that I myself, as Khanyi Tshabalala, would never really deem myself an individual in any circumstance, because I acknowledge that I come from this rich lineage that's full of many people, and I just represent all of those people. So I would never really see myself as an individual. Yet in Western culture, people perceive themselves as individuals, and that sort of leads to this hyper individualism and individualistic mindset that people are living in. And this is what's exacerbating the loneliness pandemic, right? Because people have this perception that I need to do it on my own. And if I don't do it on my own, then I'm weak. Whereas it's just one perspective and it's just one way of living. I think that the happy, maybe the happy in between is sort of finding a balance between the two, because of course over reliance on community is also dangerous. You do also have to be self-sufficient. But I will come around to the true, I think, belonging that we're all lacking, and the real separation, and perhaps that then deals with both sides of the coin. But it's such a nuanced concept, and that's why I thought it's so worth unpacking it today, because as someone who has trotted the globe, I've had conversations with people just about belonging and friendships, and how, even as an adult, you struggle to make friendships as an adult, because so much of your sense of self is already formed. When you find people that you don't necessarily align with, you'll have superficial friendships, and that in itself can leave you feeling quite lonely. Because the quote that I love the most, besides obviously this one, treat your life like it's an honor to be you. And this is where I'll pause and say, I hope you've noticed that, Seize the Light Foundation has dropped some merch, and I cannot wait for everybody to have access to our merch. We're really looking to roll out this line of just affirmations, because why not walk around and just be reminded that you should treat your life as an honor to be you? Sorry, I digress. So, and I've literally even forgotten where I was now, because now I wanted to be funny and make a joke. I guess that's what I get for trying to be funny on the solo cast. But I think that so much of my personality is hidden in these. Whereas I think this is now my opportunity to really like be my authentic and true self even more on camera. I'm not so much a person who quickly becomes themselves. So this is why I think I've studied so much about social connections, because even for me, as I say, like moving abroad, I remember now where I was. I've had to study a lot about, oh, why would I struggle to integrate into certain settings? And is it because my depth is able to be handled by somebody? So these are all things that I've really looked into over the past couple of years. I was going to reference a quote that I quite like, and it is that people can only meet you as deeply as they have met themselves. And I love that quote because it sort of signifies that you cannot expect to give somebody something that you do not feel yourself. So when it comes to social connections and belonging, I think that if I don't feel like I belong within myself, I may not necessarily be in a space to curate that environment for somebody else to feel like they belong with me or they feel safe in my presence. And I know that that's a very loaded statement and probably one that we will mull over, but I think that's just the crux of it. And, at the end of the day, we only really meet people as deeply as we have met ourselves. You're not able to really engage in a conversation if you haven't considered that perspective or those opinions and thoughts by yourself, because then of course there's group thinking. And I mean, I don't want to go too much into group thinking, but let's say for example you subtract group thinking in the equation. You just being able to form your own opinions, be your own person, and form your own sense of belonging, then you would be able to attract people from a more authentic place, as opposed to if you were influenced by group thinking. But I say this is not the podcast for me to go into group thinking. So back to Western, non-Western belonging and moving around and meeting people as deeply as you've met yourself. I hope like how I'm explaining it, you can sort of already see that there are differences, and it does depend on how you were raised and how you were socialized. And now, linking this to mental health, the socialization in the West around I need to do it for myself and and the hyper individualism and the over self reliance is the same approach to mental health, where people are just expected to know what to do for themselves. Companies will say, we've got all the resources at your disposal, go for your life and, access them when you need them. So the approach in itself is Western, and in a sense, that's what's making it detrimental, because the healing cannot necessarily always take place as an individual, because a lot of the issues and wounds and hurt that we're experiencing as a collective. There's collective events that have transpired, even if we look through history, depending on obviously what you believe in, but it can go as far back as the wars, because those psychological those events have psychologically damaged us as a collective, and because we've not really recovered in the best way, we're still traumatized and wounded. Another example I would make, for example, is South Africa. So South Africa obviously is a good country to study, because South Africa experienced apartheid, and it's not a distant part of history, right? Because when I talk about the wars, a lot of what we're speaking about is it's written down, but it's from a certain person's perspective. So of course there's biases, and we may not necessarily know how accurate the information we're reading is. But when it comes to South Africa, obviously for me, being a South African and having access to people that literally lived through apartheid, you're getting the real time explanation of what actually transpired during that time. And the book that I love in holistic health, from Dr. Basil van der Kolk, The Body Keeps the Score, basically also salionates apartheid South Africa and how we had the TRC, which is the Truth and Reconciliation Committee. And at the GRC, South Africans, the retribution that they decided and how they decided to restore justice was by talking. So they just had a committee, and the perpetrators and the victims would come together in a forum, and you had, the police officers who did bad things come and say, I admit to doing this. And then the parents of, kids that had died during 1976 and throughout that time could hear exactly what transpired and the ills that took place. But Dr. Bezo van der Kolk raises the point that South Africa is a traumatized nation because all we ever did about apartheid was talk. Whereas when you understand the mind and body connection, your emotional body, in order for you to move from a traumatic event, you actually need to work with your physical body. And the only way you need to work with your emotional body. And the only way that you work with your emotional body is through your physical body. So it would be through movement. So it's a very valid point to raise that, for as long as I guess South Africans don't heal uh, as a collective in movement, arguably then we would remain a traumatized nation. And because not everybody has access to the knowledge, people may not necessarily realize that the trauma is lingering and it's being perpetuated continually because it hasn't necessarily been addressed in a more holistic perspective. It was addressed from a Western psychology of we're going to all sit around and discuss what happened. Whereas for some people, that's not healing. You sitting down and talking about a traumatic event over and over again is only re-triggering you as opposed to healing you. Whereas if we move together, if we breathe together, then the emotional body would appreciate that the traumatic event is over and it will put itself in a position to move on. So I make that example because I think it's important. And I also referenced in the West, I mean, you've got your World War Ones, your World War Twos, the Great Depression, all events that, again, the best solution that was presented to society in that time was talk therapy. But now there's a real recognition that we cannot just administer talk therapy without the somatics, but also you cannot administer the somatics without the collective, because as I say, a lot of what we're experiencing is as a collective. But when we glorify this individualism of I, and we make people feel bad for needing other people. I almost even myself said wanting other people, right? Because having other people around is not even a want, it's a need. And it's something that we are all being shamed. When you say, I need people around me, I need friends, I need support, the Western hyper individualism will make you feel bad for those things. Yet these are the very things that make us thrive as humans. We thrive in community. And I love to go back to history. I love to go back to nature. There are no animals that are thriving that are not moving in tribes and in packs. And the same goes for the fauna and the flora. Like, you just need to look around in nature and see that everything is done as a collective, as a community. Real thriving happens in that safe and secure environment. So that's why I think, for me, I value that community. So with this Western approach, I would say that we have taken, it's been pervasive because it's also impacted workplace and academic policies as well. In one of the entrepreneurship spaces that I was in, it was interesting that they were saying that everything about school is the direct opposite of entrepreneurship, because at school they say, if you don't look at your the person sitting next to you's answers when you're writing a test, so they perpetuate non-collaboration, obviously, like not plagiarizing, but at the same time, real creativity is not really nourished because everything is standardized, right? And are we really at a point where we're saying, as a society, we only really got academically intelligent once we had a standardized model of measuring intellect? I don't necessarily think that's true, because we only need to go back to inventions. There are people that invented things that did not even go through an academic system. So are we trying to suggest that those people are not intellectually inclined? I'm not sure. In my opinion, not. But it was so easy to just see how we're influenced by a lot of these things. Whereas in entrepreneurship, you have to collaborate with people. You have to see what other people are doing. And even if that's you just studying your competitor analysis is what's most critical, because you have to prove to people why your product or your business or your service stands out from others. So how else are you going to know that if you're not studying from what other people are doing? So it was just interesting to me that even the mindset that we are, I almost said indoctrinated, but I think it's not a strong word to use, but it is, because it is an indoctrination at the end of the day. Even the mindset that we indoctrinated with, it perpetuates individualism, but that is to our detriment. In most settings, I don't necessarily, in my mind, I've literally been studying so many settings, and I can't see a setting where individualism is a good thing. I think for as long as you're only concerned about yourself, I don't think that the results and where we'll go to as a society will ever be positive. And another interesting thing is, you going to talk therapy and talking to your therapist one on one about collective issues. That's another reason why a lot of people are not necessarily healing. Um, if you go to your therapist, for example, and talk about your toxic boss at work, the reason you're not healing is, one, like, your toxic boss is not with you in the therapy session, so you're not getting their perspective of their toxicity. But also, the toxicity is being experienced in a as a collective, in an environment, as I've explained in some of my notes, that even with something like racism is experienced as an ecosystem. People will think, oh, thank God it's not happening to me. Yes, but even as a bystander, by osmosis, you're affected. Our emotions and our emotional body, it works like that. You are affected by these emotions. So if you're day in and day out watching somebody being bullied, or experiencing any ism that exists, because so many exist, you absorb that energy, whether you like it or not, and whether you want to acknowledge it or not. That is a scientific that is what happens scientifically. You absorb these things, right? So to say that you would then go to your therapist and talk one on one about something that is obviously experienced in a collective environment and has so many intricacies, because another thing when it comes to the Western view of social connections and mental health is, we view a lot of these things as it's something that you need to solve, and you cannot solve it alone. These things are all connected, and there's also the propensity to compartmentalize issues. And I don't think it's possible to compartmentalize anything. And I'm hoping that our work at Seize the Light is demonstrating that, because we've never looked at mental health from one singular lens. We've recognized it is inextricably linked to so many things: the environment, the academic system, uh, just good health and well-being, partnerships. There are a plethora of spheres within the work that we're doing where mental health finds itself relevant. So we cannot afford to compartmentalize the solution either. But then you going to one-on-one therapy with your therapist is sort of suggesting you've compartmentalized it, and then you've not only infantilized yourself because you only believe that your healing could come through speaking to somebody else who's another adult, as in suggesting that you don't know what's best for you and you're not able to process that circumstance. So there's a whole lot of things I think that come into play when we talk about the loneliness pandemic and isolation. We really need to rethink how we are even perceiving the solutions, because I don't think the solutions are found in individualistic approaches. The last point that I wanted to make was just around holistic health. And I think for me, holistic health really has the capacity to deliver the solution to a lot of, I hate to use the word issues because I feel like when you say issues, people think something is wrong. And I've had to watch my language so much since I've gone along this journey, because I realize people immediately, because they're in such a black and white mindset, this or that mindset, nobody wants to enjoy the gray area anymore. And people are not into critically thinking. So when you say something, they take it and then run with the extreme, whatever polarity they find themselves in. But I say that holistic health has the capability or capacity to perhaps resolve some of these social connection and loneliness issues, because how else do you get to know yourself other than going inwards and going in solitude and really doing that work of understanding who you are as a person before you present yourself to the world? Because you're also not going to be a good source of social connection to somebody else if you don't even feel great yourself, or you're not even connected to yourself. So at the beginning, I spoke about unpacking the first separation or disconnection point, and that happens at birth. So that's why everybody cries when they, enter this realm. It's that first separation, right? And we work in this lifetime to reconnect ourselves to that version of ourselves, our child selves. But because of how we're living, we disconnect from ourselves. We're not connected mind body. So a lot of people are operating too much in the mind and not enough in the body, not enough from the heart. And that shows and that informs even your social connections, because you lose the authenticity. You even lose the capacity to really even really connect with people. A lot of people, if you're disconnected from yourself and you don't even know yourself, how exactly do you think you're going to form a bond with somebody else? Because some people are, of course, more, let me say, like better positioned to sense inauthenticity than others. And this is what's creating this tension and this difficulty in forming these social connections. It's a lot deeper than just the phones and the technology. I think that it does come down to the quality of people that we are. I think because of that separation and us not really doing the work to reconnect to our child selves, this is what's causing the loneliness epidemic. If we all took time to reconnect back to ourselves and became better to ourselves first, then we would be able to be more quality. The word quality came to mind. We would be quality connections, because I think that's the issue when it comes to social connections. You can be socially connected, but are they quality connections? And there's no point in having 10,000 friends, and I should actually say friends, because I mean, if you're still feeling lonely, are they your friends? Versus having five friends that may be good quality friends. So the loneliness pandemic is a lot more nuanced and complex than what people may think of. Okay, well, let's just throw a group of people together. You can still be lonely in a crowd. So it's more about the quality of the connection. But as I say, it is how well connected are the people that you're trying to connect it to, how well connected are they to themselves first in order for you to then connect to those people. I've said a lot on this podcast, and yeah, as I've said, for me, social connections, I think I might make a part two, because there's actually so much more that I can say about it. Initially, I thought I would record for a short time, but now that I realize as well, every time I talk about these topics, something else will be sparked in me where I realize actually we also need to look at that. And there's another angle and aspect that I actually want to also highlight. So I think probably an episode two is, well, another episode maybe needed. But I hope that you receive this episode with light as usual, because the objective is to educate and to advocate for us returning to ourselves. Because when we return to ourselves and we feel we belong and we feel whole, will be quality connections to other people, and will be reducing the loneliness epidemic that we're experiencing. If you are enjoying this episode or you've gotten this far, I would please ask that you would subscribe to the channel, because that really helps. Also, feel free to share it with somebody who you feel would benefit from the conversation. I know a lot of people shy away from these topics, and again, we're so disconnected. Some people may not even see the problem. They've been carrying on in superficial relationships, jobs, family relationships for so long that when they hear of anything that's not that, they may not necessarily be in a space to receive it. But I think if your intention is there by sending it to them, then you've done your part. I hope that you have enjoyed this episode of the Lantern podcast. And I just want to leave you with the quote that I mentioned: people can only meet you as deeply as they have met themselves. So I do want to encourage you to meet yourself and get to know yourself, because, a lot of people will ask the question, what can I do to solve the loneliness pandemic? And I think in your own personal capacity, it would be doing the internal work so that you become a quality connection and source for somebody else. And I will end it there. Thank you so much for listening to the Lantern podcast, and I will see you on part 2.